So let's have a look, if we can, at some of the stories. No spoilers, obviously. But perhaps, Miranda, would you like to start? Just give us an overview of your story in the book.
Absolutely. My story begins with someone waking up in utter darkness. And she has to, through the course of the story, she is working to find out where she is, but also to try to find a way back to something that is familiar, because she's in complete blackness. And so she is discovering her environment with her fingers, with smell, because she cannot use her eyes, obviously, in the darkness. And as she is exploring and starting to discover where she is, she starts to piece together some rather grisly details and some rather I'd say unexpected pieces that she is uncovering. And I don't want to give away too much, because this is a huge part of what the story is that sort of uncovering. But the horrific element there is obviously losing the ability to see suddenly and without expectation. You're, just waking up unable to determine where you are, completely unrecognizable, and then trying to figure out what to do from there. There's no assistance. There's no one to communicate with. There's nothing. So that's where the horror begins with that particular story, a very sort of natural psychological horror of what might happen to us if suddenly deprived of all of the tools that we are used to using for making our way through an environment or assessing where we are or reaching safety or familiarity. That's how it begins, and gets worse.
That terrifying, even to start with. Yeah, the thought of waking up and not being able to see anything, something that we are so used to. Yeah, that's terrifying to start with, isn't it? Adele, what about your story?
Mine's called Spanish Jones, and it's a story in 3 parts. The first part is set in a historical era, and it's based on a local island called Hilbury Island, which is just off the Wirral Peninsula. A real place, you can go and visit it. And it involves pirates and selkies. The island does actually have a history of pirates, but not quite the way I've written it. But yeah. And then part 2, I don't want to give too much away, obviously. Part 2 comes more into present time, and you've got a bit of conflict between human and selkie. And then part 3, each part follows on. And then part 3 is more about a group of probably Wiccans. I say probably because I've kind of invented the ritual, so nobody can cause offence anywhere. And things don't go quite right. And it features a conflict between traditional witchcraft and modern versions of witchcraft, and how some people approve and some people don't, and what happens
That's
when the
real life,
selkies
isn't
meet
it?
with it. Yeah, that's right.
It's real life.
Yeah. The older generation meeting the younger generation and thinking, that's not how you should do things. It is a story. It's not fact, obviously.
Oh, I don't know. I'm quite familiar with that scenario.
A bit of humour in there anyway.
Oh, good. I like a bit of humour with my horror.
The third part is tongue-in-cheek a little bit. Bit of humour.
Brilliant.
I think it made Raven chuckle when he read it the first time.
Brilliant. Jaclyn, what about your story?
It's called Captured, and it's an erotic thriller.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, the idea for I really don't know how to say this without, I don't want any spoilers.
We just want teasers. We just want people to go, oh, I'd like to read that.
Okay. Well, it starts off with the main character in a shop looking for items of a ritual. And okay, I know it's going to sound funny considering where she is, but trust me,
No, that actually makes sense, which is very bizarre, but yes, it makes sense.
Yeah, it is. I did that on purpose. I wanted to set it differently than how I normally start. But I had her like a lot of inner dialogue, her worrying about something because her husband's kidnapped. And that's all, I'll say. And with that, there's a serial killer. And it just gets good.
So you'll have to read the book to find out the rest.
Yeah. But like I said, my idea for it really have a neat story. My husband and I were on our date night at one of our favorite Asian restaurants, and we were just taking selfies and joking around, and he said something that at the time I really wasn't sure why he was kidnapped, but I wanted to connect it, and I wanted to make sure it wasn't like my series. I wanted to separate it. And so, yeah, because of his comment, I thought, ooh, that's why he's kidnapped. So I pulled out a notepad and I started writing some ideas. And
to find out more, you'll have to read the book.
yes.
And then Rhea, what about your story?
My story is about a middle-aged woman who life gets thrown into a tailspin basically, and she's in a vulnerable situation. And she finds herself in a small town, and it's based on a real small town in Montana. And she's a stranger in this town. She's new, and she's typically a pretty strong witch, and she doesn't get scared easily. And a series of events or different things happen to build up more and more and more fear in her. And she finds herself, probably for the first time in her life, helpless, really, and out of her depths, spiritually and physically and so on. I try to get across elements of loneliness at that point, because I think as for a lot of women, as we reach middle age, we're leaving behind one stage of life and we're entering another. And it's a very shaky, unsure time. But I didn't want to focus so much on that, we lost the fact that she's really a woman and she's really going through all the things that women go through and has the same weaknesses, desires, and all the things that us women think about, whatever age we are, really. I'm kind of unsure what else to say about the main character. The idea of the story came when I spent time myself in this small town in Montana. So some of the events in this story have actually happened. And some, I'll leave that up to the reader to decide which is which. Yes, there is erotica in my story. This is my first real venture into that. And it was fun. It really was. So, yeah, I might try it again. We'll see. So I don't really want to go too much into detail, except for that, at the end of the day, she accepts her situation, which is also unusual, because this particular woman likes to take matters into her own hands and doesn't get pushed around easily. That's part of the horror, I believe.
Excellent. And of course, Raven, you have a story as well. What outline of your story? A teaser for your story?
Well, honestly, I find it difficult to summarize my story. It's my first venture into fiction, so readers go easy on me. But I've heard really good things about it, and from those who have done a preview read. So I'm happy to hear that. A brief summary is that my story revolves around, and it opens with erotica. It's another. I think ours are the three, Jaclyn and Rhea's and mine, that include erotic elements. or more, well, others do too, but ours are a little bit more explicit, deliciously explicit. And so mine revolves around a relationship between two young men and the dynamics and also occult elements included in that. And I would actually refer to Associate Editor Miranda. Would you mind summarizing my story, Miranda, a little better than I can? Because I'm struggling with how to summarize it. I'd prefer your external editorial.
I'd be happy to give it a shot. Actually, I was just thinking as you were speaking, Raven, about how many of the stories in this anthology kind of touch on what can go wrong in the occult when it is not treated with respect and dignity. And I think that that is a common thread through several of the stories in this anthology, which is very interesting. I think it's very interesting to see those common themes arise when people didn't work together originally to create this. It sort of speaks to our time and speaks to our own thoughts about where we are in our lives and where we are in our world, I think. But the Raven story, I think, is really beautiful because the protagonist is quite innocent and is faced with that sort of vulnerability that I think many of us have in young love and wanting to connect with someone and wanting to trust them and wanting to imagine a future while maybe starting to realize that it's not as perfect as we might be imagining. And those not so perfect elements start to become glaringly obvious to the point of like, oh, do I need to do something here? Do I need to change something here? And it starts to change even the tone of the protagonist's perception of the world. You start to recognize how love and someone close to you can influence how you see the world, how you react to the world. And it's sort of devastating in that way. I think it's an underlying level of the overlying horror that is present in the story is this sort of underlying psychological horror, which is present in several of the stories. But I think it's something that's really, to use your word from before, Raven, delicious in the story because it is so relatable. And to say like, I've been there, I've put myself out there like that before, to be to feel like that isn't reciprocated and where that can take you and how you decide what to do with that. Do I try to fix this? Do I try to leave? Can I leave? I think that's an element of very real psychological horror that many of us have found ourselves in, that is like an underlying or foundational layer of the horror that is in Raven's story. And bringing in what can happen when we don't treat the mystics with respect, which is also a big element, I think, of that story, that those two things combining as it sort of exposes who is this person really and who did I love. I think it's a really important part of that story.
Oh, I appreciate that. That's a beautiful summary.
Intriguing, which is the important part.